You unravel me with a melody. You surround me with a song of deliverance from my enemies, till all my fears are gone. I'm no longer a slave to fear. I am a child of God. I'm no longer a slave to fear. I am a child of God. From my mother's womb, you have chosen me. Love has called my name. I've been born again into your family. All your blood flows through my veins. I'm no longer a slave to fear. I am a child of God. I'm no longer a slave to fear. I am a child of God. I am surrounded by the arms of the Father. I am surrounded by songs of deliverance. We've been liberated from our bondage. We're the sons and the daughters. Let us sing our freedom. Whoa, whoa, You split the sea so I could walk right through it. My fears were drowned in perfect love. You rescued me and I will stand and sing. I am a child of God. Oh, I am a child of God. I'm no longer a slave to fear. I am a child of God. I'm no longer a slave to fear. I am a child of God. Oh, yes, I am a child of God. You were a lover before time's beginning. You gave your love freely, withholding nothing. Jesus, my Jesus, you carried the weight of the world on your shoulders. You stopped at nothing to prove you were for us. Jesus, my Jesus. It's extravagant. It doesn't make sense. We'll never comprehend the way you love us. It's unthinkable. Only heaven knows just how far you'd go to say you love us, to say you love us, to say you love us. You don't belittle our pain and our suffering. You comfort us in our greatest unraveling, Jesus, my Jesus. You are the dawn that is breaking within me. You are the sun that is rising around me, Jesus. Oh, my Jesus. It's extravagant. Oh, it doesn't make sense. We'll never comprehend the way you love us. It's unthinkable. Only heaven knows just how far you'd go to say you love us, to say you love us, to say you love us. Here is all my love, it's yours, no conditions when you pull me close. No, I won't resist, and here is all my love, it's yours, no conditions when you pull me close. No, I won't resist it. I won't resist it. I won't resist it. I won't resist it. It's extravagant. It doesn't make sense. We'll never comprehend the way you love us. It's unthinkable. Only heaven knows just how far you go to say you love us, 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 to say you love us.
The news bombards us with new social and political issues every day. From social justice to racism to sexuality and everything in between. How do we respond to these issues, and what do we say when confronted with these confounding topics?
Hey, thanks for jumping in on today's conversation. If you've missed some of the other conversations, we're in a series called In the News. And so we're taking topics and issues that are relevant and in the news today, and we're talking about what the gospel has to say about them. If you've missed any of them, I would encourage you to go back and check them, especially the first one, the gospel, blessed and bruised. It's a real foundational conversation on how we approach all these other things. And today's conversation that you're jumping into is on human sexuality. There are lots of questions about sex and sexuality out there, and questions about sex and sexuality create questions about God, because God created us sexual beings. So when sexuality becomes confusing, God can become confusing. And so it's important for us to have these conversations. And to have the conversation today, I want to share a story of Jesus. All of these conversations are based in the gospel. It comes from John chapter 4. We commonly refer to it as Jesus and the woman at the well, or Jesus and the Samaritan woman. So if you have a Bible or a phone app on your phone, I would encourage you to go there. And John chapter 4, you may be familiar with the story. This may be the first time you're hearing it. So I'm going to read most of the story to us. John chapter 4, verse 1 says, "Now when Jesus learned that the Pharisees had heard that Jesus was making and baptizing more disciples than John, although Jesus himself did not baptize, but only his disciples, he left Judea and departed again for Galilee. And he had to pass through Samaria." Now, this is very interesting wording. Let me give you some geography here. So Jesus was in Judea in the south, and he was going to go to Galilee in the north, and Samaria was between the two. So if you're in Texas and you want to go to Kansas, you got to go through Oklahoma. You don't really have to go through Oklahoma. Like if you just are anti-Oklahoma, you could go around to the west or around to the east. And when Jesus says here, when John tells us that he had to pass through Samaria, he didn't really have to pass through Samaria. In fact, most of the time, a devout Jew would not pass through Samaria because Jews and Samaritans did not get along. In fact, so much so that Jews would go way out of their way to the west or way out of their way to the east to actually get to Galilee from Judea. But Jesus had a divine appointment. And so he had to pass through Samaria. And I would just like to say here, we have to have these conversations. These are conversations that people are wrestling with and grappling with. And so it's good for us to lean in on these conversations and to dialogue. And that's what we want this to be. I don't want this to just be a message I'm preaching. I want you to dialogue with me. I would love to you to go to the chat box and ask questions or comment. And I promise I can't right now, but as soon as I can, I will get to you. I will respond to your question. And I would encourage you to do that because we really need to have these conversations. So verse 4, he had to pass through Samaria. So he came to a town of Samaria called Sychar, near the field that Jacob had given to his son Joseph. Jacob's well was there. Now hang on to that because we're going to come back to Jacob's well at the very end of today's message. So Jesus, wearied as he was from his journey, was sitting beside the well. It was about the 6th hour. That means it was noontime. That was not a common time for people to come to the well. Women usually came to the well. They were the ones who were responsible for drawing water and taking it back into their family, into the village. But it didn't usually happen at the noon hour. So this was already uncommon. Verse 7, a woman from Samaria came to draw water, and Jesus said to her, "Give me a drink." For his disciples had gone away into the city to buy food. And the Samaritan woman said to him, "How is it that you, a Jew, ask for a drink from me, a woman of Samaria?" And she even admits, for Jews have no dealings with Samaritans. In fact, a male Jew would not have any dealings whatsoever with a female Samaritan. And so Jesus says to her, "Give me a drink." Now, we need to understand the importance of what Jesus says to her, because Jesus says, "I'm going to touch my lips to the same cup your lips touch." Now, if you know the story of the woman at the well, you may be thinking, where is he going with this in regards to human sexuality? And I've never heard this message preached about human sexuality, but actually I think it has a lot to us to say about our sex and sexuality. And I think the biggest message, or one of the biggest messages, is Jesus put his lips on her cup. Jesus entered into this woman's world, to one of those people's worlds. He shouldn't even be having a conversation with her, much less drinking from her cup. But I need us to see here that Jesus' initial response to this woman is not a response of judgment. He doesn't preach to her. He doesn't just jump right in, telling her anything about her life, which he's going to get to here in just a little bit. The first thing he does is meet her with grace. Complete, unabandoned grace. And he does that without changing who he is. He enters into her world without compromising anything about him. And he simply entered into her world. A recent study from Barna does so many church studies, but a recent study from Barna said that the number one quality non-Christians, and this is their terminology, lapsed Christians, the number one quality non-Christians and lapsed Christians look for in a person with whom to talk about faith issues is that they listen without judgment. That's the number one quality they want, is someone who will just have a conversation about faith with them with no judgment, but with 100% grace. However, in that same study, they found that only 34% say the Christians they know possess that quality. Jesus put his lips to the woman's cup. He entered into her world, into the world of one of those people. You can define those people in so many different ways. The first thing we have to see that Jesus did was step into their story, step into their experience, step into her story and her experience. And Jesus answers her in verse 10. If you knew the gift of God and who it is that is saying to you, give me a drink, you would have asked him and he would have given you living water. And they have this whole conversation about water and living water. And Jesus is saying, I'm the living water. And if you drink my living water, you'll never thirst again. And she's completely confused and doesn't really have any idea what he's talking about. But they're just engaging in conversation. Her experience, Jesus' experience, and they simply engage in a listening conversation. What would happen in our world when it came to the issues around sexuality if we just took the time to enter into dialogue with other people, especially people who think differently than we do, live differently than we do, define sexuality differently than we do? What if we just sat and listened and dialogued and had conversation? Because out of that flows the next thing that happens in this story. If you skip down to verse 16, Jesus said to her, go call your husband and come here. The woman answered him, I have no husband. Jesus said to her, you are right in saying, I have no husband, for you have had 5 husbands, and the one you now have is not your husband. What you have said is true. So now Jesus goes from grace to truth. But it was the grace that he offered to her that gave him permission to speak truth to her. Now, this is Jesus. He doesn't even need permission for that. But if we want to follow Jesus' example and model Jesus' way, then what he did was offer the woman complete grace before beginning to extend to her truth, before addressing her sexual sin. So see, the story is kind of about human sexuality, because the truth he gives to her is about her sexual sin. She's been married, divorced 5 times. Now she's living with a man. She's not even married to this man. And Jesus speaks that truth into her. And so there's all of these narratives in our culture when it comes to talking about sex and sexuality. And a lot of us find truth in different narratives. And so what I want to do here for the next couple of minutes is just kind of lay out those narratives. So just go with me again, engage in dialogue with me, but just go with me on some of these narratives that we find in our culture, okay? The first narrative when it comes to human sexuality, I call the cultural narrative. And this is not just about sex or sexuality, all right? The cultural narrative basically at its point says that whatever makes you happy, do that. That's the prevailing narrative of our day. We live in a culture where it's all about your life and the happiness that you have in that life and however you can be fulfilled in that life. And so when it comes to sex and sexuality, that cultural narrative says, hey, whatever brings our bodies the most pleasure, then do that. Whatever you can do to satisfy yourself and your body, then do that. That's the prevailing cultural narrative. Now, we have to be careful, because sometimes in that cultural narrative, we want to pick and choose the things in that narrative that we don't find as truth or that we don't agree with. And obviously some of those hotter issues or topics in today's news are the issues surrounding LGBTQ+, the issues surrounding transgender or gender confusion. And sometimes we want to just pounce on the cultural narratives around those things. But we have to realize that when we're talking about human sexuality, it's so much more than those things. It's lust, it's pornography, it's divorce, it's adultery, it's premarital sex. And all of those things have a cultural narrative right now that says, hey, whatever makes you the most happy, then go and do those things. And the danger with the cultural narrative, well, there's many dangers, but one of the dangers that exists in our culture is, now the buzzword is cancel culture, right? So you can have your truth and you can have your culture and you can believe whatever makes you happy, then go and do that, as long as it doesn't infringe on what makes me happy. And as long as those two things don't, because if you are infringing on something that doesn't, do the same for me, then I'm just going to cancel you and we're going to have a disagreement about truth. So the problem with the cultural narrative is that there's no absolute truth, and that there's a distant God, and this distant God doesn't give us, I want to say demands and limits, but it's not demands and limits as much as it is things that he knows are best for us. And that's kind of the cultural narrative. The other extreme of that, another narrative that we have in our culture, we call the purity narrative, or I call the purity narrative. And the purity narrative we can also refer to as the traditional church narrative, the traditional Orthodox church narrative. And that is, on any of these issues related to sex and sexuality, we like to go back to Leviticus. There's other verses in the Old Testament. We like to go to Paul's words in Romans chapter 1. Paul says some other things. We even take some things that Jesus said. And we like to pull one verse out of the entire Bible, and when we like to use that verse to preach against or judge against the cultural narrative. Now, there's absolutely truth in a lot of what we pull out of the Bible. And I had a seminary professor who used to say this. He said, a text without a context is only a pretext for you to mean whatever you want it to mean. And so if we take verses out of the Bible and not put them in the entire context of not only where they're found, but the whole Bible, then we can use those as weapons, literally, to defend a truth that we believe to be true, or a narrative that we believe to be true. And the purity narrative says to people, listen, God hates your sin, and because of that, God hates you. Now, we don't tell people that, but that's what the purity narrative sometimes communicates to people. And so because of that, the danger of the purity narrative is that we have people deconstructing from faith because their truth doesn't line up with the purity narrative or the verses that we use to throw out at people. So I would like to offer up an alternative narrative. And I call this narrative the biblical narrative. Because the biblical narrative of sexuality it is from the beginning of the Bible to the end of the Bible. And there's a story of sexuality in the Bible, and the story is so much more than a lot of the issues that we try to grapple with and deal with today. Let's go back to the very beginning, okay? The beginning, I mean the literal beginning in Genesis, when God creates. God creates male and God creates female in His image. Now, this is interesting because oftentimes we tell the story of, oh, well, God took female from Adam's rib. And so Adam lost a rib and that rib created female. But really, if you do a closer examination of the Hebrew language there, that word doesn't just mean rib, it means side. So woman came from man's side. So God created Adam and then took Adam's side and created female. And the Hebrew word for man is ish. The Hebrew word for woman is ishah. And there's one Hebrew letter different in both of those words that describe male and female. So the Hebrew word for man, ish, is missing one letter that makes up isha. And isha is missing one letter that makes up the word man. And those words in Hebrew are yod and hey. And here's the cool thing. Yod and hey, in the rest of the Hebrew Old Testament, when those two words are put together, they form the word Yahweh, which is God. And so we're created literally in God's image, male and female, not just male, not just female. Male and female are created in God's image, which is why it makes more sense in Genesis chapter 2, verse 24, that the creation story says, "Therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh." It's not this, "Oh, you complete me." It's not that at all. It's that we're both made in His image, and together we form the image of Yahweh, of God. And then we get to Genesis chapter 3. We experience the fall, and sin enters the world. And because of that, we now live in a broken, fallen world. And the rest of the biblical narrative, especially when it comes to human sexuality, is God restoring our sexuality from a broken place to a place of wholeness. And we see that throughout the rest of the Bible, so that our sexuality, the yod and the hey, experience and express the very image and nature of God. We see this in Romans chapter 1. Which is sometimes one of those places that we take out of context for the purity narrative. But there, Paul talks about how we've exchanged, because of the fall, we've now exchanged the Creator for the created, and we now worship the created instead of the Creator. And so now we're worshiping things that God created instead of worshiping the Creator, Yahweh. And Paul, over in Ephesians chapter 5, then says that marriage between man and woman, between male and female, is a greater picture of revelation, of this sexuality that says we are also Jesus' bride. The church is Jesus' bride. So we are the bride of Christ. And marriage is a picture of what that looks like. You continue to read in Revelation and you see more of that revelation, that Jesus is coming back for His bride. And that image, or that relationship between a man and a woman in marriage, is one that represents that revelation of our sexuality. When Jesus was talked, Matthew chapter 19, I believe it's 19, when Jesus was approached about divorce, He goes back to this creation. He doesn't even answer the question about divorce. He goes back to the story of creation. Because from creation to revelation, there's this biblical view of our human sexuality, of male and female coming together. And in that relationship, we represent Yahweh, and we represent the bride of Christ and the revelation of what that looks like. Now, some of that's still a mystery, which is why it's very interesting where Jesus goes next in the story of the woman at the well. Actually, the woman is the one that goes there. She says in verse 19, "The woman said to him, 'Sir, I perceive that you're a prophet.'" After Jesus shared truth with her, "I perceive you're a prophet." And here's what she says, "Our fathers worshiped on this mountain, but you say that in Jerusalem is the place where the people ought to worship." Basically, what she's doing is changing the subject, right? Jesus is going to share some truth with her about her sexuality, and she's like, let's talk about something else. "So we say that we worship on this mountain, but you say that you're supposed to worship in Jerusalem. So what's the correct answer?" And Jesus, as only Jesus can do, "Woman, believe me, the hour is coming when neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem you will worship the Father. You worship what you do not know. We worship what we know, for salvation is from the Jews. But the hour is coming and is now here when true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth." Verse 24, "God is spirit, and those who worship Him must worship in spirit and in truth." Listen, what Jesus is saying, even though she changed the topic, is that the Spirit reveals the truth. Jesus said that in John chapter 16, verse 13, when He was talking about how He was going to leave and the Holy Spirit was going to come. And there He said, the Spirit will guide you into all truth. What does that mean for us in regards to this conversation around human sexuality? It means it's not our job to change anyone. It's the Holy Spirit's job. The Holy Spirit is the one who convicts us. The Holy Spirit is the one who teaches us. The Holy Spirit is the one who guides us. And that's one of the problems with the purity principle is we take it on ourselves and to make it our job, but that's not our job. It's the Holy Spirit's job. You see, we're told in John chapter 1, verse 14 that Jesus came full of grace and truth, and we see this here in the story. And oftentimes we think, oh, we've got to balance grace and truth. So Jesus was 50% grace and he was 50% truth, and you put those together and it makes 100%. No, Jesus was 100% grace and he was 100% truth. And we see here in the story, he gave 100% grace to the woman and he gave 100% truth to the woman. And our goal when it comes to the issues of human sexuality of our day, listen, I'm not talking about just LGBTQ plus or gender dysphoria. I'm talking about pornography and lust and divorce and premarital sex, all of the brokenness around our human sexuality. Our goal is to give unrestricted love 100% of the time, while we also give uncompromised truth 100% of the time. Jesus' grace allowed him to speak truth to the woman. And you go on with the rest of the story. The disciples come back. They've got food because they went in. Jesus says, hey, I'm not hungry. I've got food you don't know about. The disciples are like, what? We wasted all this time and this money going in and getting food. Now he says he's not even hungry. And he goes on and he begins to say, my food, I'm in verse 34, my food is to do the will of him who sent me and to accomplish his work. There are 4 months, then comes the harvest. Look, I tell you, lift up your eyes and see that the fields are white for harvest. The disciples are going, what is he saying? What is he talking about? And then you jump down to verse 39. Many Samaritans from that town believed in him because of the woman's testimony. He told me all that I ever did. That woman left that well a changed woman. And she went into her village, talked to many that she was probably shameful to talk to, told the story of her encounter with Jesus at the well, and they too experienced and changed and transformed lives. That's what Jesus was saying when the harvest is plentiful. His grace and his truth offered that woman and many in her village a relationship with him. This is often where we miss it when it comes to the issue of human sexuality. We're often more concerned that someone conform to truth than that they know Jesus. We're often so concerned that someone live the way we think they should live, rather than introducing them to a relationship with Jesus. And sharing the gospel with them and letting Jesus and the truth of the Holy Spirit do his work. Tony Evans shares this great story. I told you to hang on to the point of Jacob's well. We're told, and why are we told that this was Jacob's well? Well, because Jacob's well held common significance for the Jews and the Samaritans. It was something that the Jews and the Samaritans could both appreciate. It was something that they could both find common ground with. They both knew the significance of Jacob's well, and they loved Jacob's well. It was a common factor for them to hang on to. Tony Evans tells this story about mayonnaise. He says he loves mayonnaise on his sandwiches, but here's what he knows about mayonnaise. Mayonnaise is made of two things that don't go together. It's made of oil and it's made of water. Well, oil and water don't mix. So how do you make mayonnaise out of oil and water? And he says there's an ingredient in mayonnaise, the secret ingredient, that brings the oil and the water together, and that ingredient is egg. You put egg and oil and water, and the egg reaches out and grabs the oil, and it reaches out and grabs the water, and it brings them together. In science, egg is known as an emulsifier. It brings two things that don't commonly go together, and it makes mayonnaise. Jacob's well was that for Jews and Samaritans. Even deeper, the emulsifier today when it comes to our conversations about human sexuality is the gospel. Yes, there are people on this extreme, and yes, there are people on this extreme. There's the culture narrative, there's the purity narrative, but in the middle, there's a biblical narrative. There's a gospel narrative. And that gospel narrative is 100% grace and 100% truth. Jesus never did not extend grace. Jesus never did not extend truth. Those are double negatives, but you'll remember it because the gospel was the unifying factor. And so in our conversations about sexuality, we should be about the gospel. Preach the gospel, extend grace of the gospel, extend truth of the gospel, and let the gospel do its work. I'd love to hear your thoughts.